Hello, welcome to Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby. In this video, we're going to be talking about Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality. We're going to be looking at the third essay, or the third treatise. So let's go ahead and get started. The title of the third treatise is What is the Meaning of the Ascetic Ideal? And what we're going to see here, before I sort of begin to get into and trace through the key points, and there's a lot of them, of the things that Nietzsche brings up in this essay, let's do a quick brief overview of what we've looked at. So for instance, if you recall, the first essay in the Genealogy of Morality concerns the distinction between good and evil and good and bad. Good and evil is essentially the moral dichotomy of values implicit in what Nietzsche calls slave morality. Conversely, good and bad refers to master morality. And ultimately, what Nietzsche thinks is that good and evil developed over time from its historical roots in master morality. So, slave morality gets its title from the idea that a slave revolt given out of the ressentiment or the resentment that the slaves held for the masters within the Roman Empire. Particularly, he's thinking about what Jesus Christ does in his creative inversion of master morality. And Nietzsche thinks that the type of morals that are indicative of contemporary modern life, where we're living today, have their roots all the way going back into this distinction. So that's what the first essay was about. We traced it quite thoroughly. In the second treatise, which is about guilt, bad conscience, and related matters, Nietzsche argues that guilt, which is a moral concept, has its roots ultimately, and not just guilt, but guilt and duty, has its roots in ultimately an economic type of activity. So originally, he thinks that what happens is, and in the second treatise, he talks a lot about the psychological components of repression that ultimately develop into what we call the bad conscience. And so you can see here in the first treatise, we see Nietzsche distinguishing master and slave morality as being indicative of the origin of moral thought. And then he digs deeper in the second treatise by looking at the bad conscience and the way in which our own psychology as human beings is giving rise to this evolution in moral thought. Or de-evolution potentially in morals in Nietzsche's view. So the third treatise here it takes a different direction, and it's on the question of the meaning of ascetic ideals. So let's jump right into it. And let's start here with, well, what exactly is asceticism? Asceticism really refers to extreme forms of self-discipline, self-denial, and abstention. And these are characteristics of the ascetic. So for instance, all of the great religions typically have a sort of ascetic ideal. So for instance, think about the Catholic priest who's given up, for instance, their ability to have sex, right? So the Catholic priest has decided to live a celibate life. So this is a form of self-denial. This is a type of asceticism. But we also see the ascetic tradition, for instance, notably within Hinduism, and we also see it within Jewish thought, within subcultures of the Jewish religion. We also see it within different domains within the Muslim tradition. In fact, we see it within Buddhism. We see it everywhere. So in this, in fact, Nietzsche actually articulates that asceticism seems to be a part of the human condition, not simply the Western condition. But there's this ascetic ideal. And of course, when we talk about master morality, and we talk about the way in which slave morality, and the way in which slave morality offers a psychological repression system upon the individual, which is one of denial of the will. Remember, Nietzsche's core concept is going to be the will to power, and asceticism is the denial of the will to power. And so Nietzsche here wants to articulate what exactly is asceticism and how does it relate, and he's going to really offer some really fascinating, interesting insights, particularly related to philosophy I'm particularly interested in, but to a number of different areas. So the ascetic ideal is the ideal of withholding one's will from the object of its desire. Okay, so let's jump into it here. Excuse me. So what is the ascetic ideal? This is the very first question that Nietzsche begins with. And the first thing we have to recognize is that the meaning of the ascetic ideal looks different under different conditions. So for instance, from the perspective of the artist, That's not Aristus, but artist. The ascetic ideal can mean a lot of things, and sometimes there's no ascetic ideal. For the philosopher, the ascetic ideal seems to be an instinct for the preconditions of a sort of higher spirituality, sort of universality. Um, when we look at the animals, there's a certain ascetic ideal. He refers to this as the angelic look of a plump, pretty animal. I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure exactly. I don't have that same sense of the ascetic ideal when I think of animals, but Nietzsche offers this. And of course, he talks about the priest, who's a very important character when we talk about asceticism. And the priest's degree of ascetic ideal seems to be grounded in a sort of supreme license for power. And we'll see that Nietzsche has a very negative view of priest, obviously, given everything he's said up to this point. And there's many different domains. So one of the things we can recognize is there's a plurality of this ascetic ideal. So what does the plurality of this ideal indicate? Well, Nietzsche offers this. He says that the ascetic ideal has meant so many things to man, however, is an expression of the basic fact of the human will. In other words, it needs a goal, and it will rather will nothingness than not will at all. So ultimately, what Nietzsche wants to articulate here is that this notion of the will to power is so central that even when in an effort to improve one's own condition, as it were, um, the asceticism is still a form of willing, even though it's a type of willing and a negated willing, right? Because the person who has decided to deny themselves of, for instance, sensuality, or deny themselves of intellectuality, or whatever the type of asceticism it is, it's always, despite its denial, it's still always a positive form of the will acting for itself. It just happens to be a will towards nothingness. So you can see here this last chapter, and this is really the conclusion and the central thesis of the whole chapter, that at the end of the day, the will to power is the central ingredient when we talk about the psychology and the development of moral thought. Now, he begins here with an example with Richard Wagner. And I'm not going to talk too much about Richard Wagner. I'm assuming that many people watching this video may have probably heard of Wagner, but don't know his music. He's a famous composer, and he wrote many, many works of art. In fact, he lived at the same time, and there was a time in which Nietzsche knew him. Um, by the time of Nietzsche's writing in this text, he's become somewhat of a critic of Wagner. So, for instance, we talked about the Übermensch in a previous video. Wagner was a suggested possibility as being an Übermensch, but this possibility is denied ultimately, right? So the thing here is what we see is that Nietzsche is drawn to the work of Wagner on the one hand, but he's also deeply repelled by his work on the other, particularly his later work. And what it looks like is that Wagner really, Wagner's operas and his compositions in the early years, seem to really recognize the power of the will and are much more aligned and indicative or analogous to this master morality. But by the end of Wagner's career, we see Wagner making a turn back to some of the more conventional themes. And here it looks like Wagner leaps over into his opposite. So you see there's a sort of kind of, in the early work you see a high emphasis on sensuality. In the later work you see an emphasis on chastity. And then, in other words, there seems to be an antithesis between these two. So the early Wagner was an enthusiastic follower of Feuerbach, for instance. Now, Feuerbach, who you may not have heard of, was an important, I believe, German intellectual. I'm mainly familiar with Feuerbach in terms of the relationship that he has with Marx, or I should say Marx has a relationship to him, because I think Feuerbach was dead by the time Marx was writing his work. Well, no, that's not true. Anyway, I shouldn't say stuff that I'm not prepared to research. I don't remember the dates. But anyway, Feuerbach, who's a staunch atheist, really captured the insight of not only Karl Marx, but in particular right here, Wagner. And so Wagner's an enthusiastic follower. And Feuerbach seemed to emphasize the need for a healthy sensuality, right? And if I remember correctly, Feuerbach's original text was a large indictment against people who believed in God, and it was a strong articulation for atheism and whatnot. So you can see there's a strong resonance here with particularly Nietzsche's insistence that God is dead and all of this sort of stuff. So, but whereas the earlier Wagner seems to be a follower of Feuerbach, the latter Wagner seems to glorify what Nietzsche calls the country simpleton. And he's thinking here of the boy Parsifal from one of Wagner's operas, right? Who's a country simpleton. And Wagner seems to glorify this, but this doesn't really make sense, at least not from the master morality sense, right? The master, in terms of master morality, in terms of the Übermensch, this idea of the country simpleton who, as being the ideal person, is quite problematic because the country simpleton is not achieving the will to power the way they really ought to, right? So, for instance, Nietzsche even says that even the blood of the Redeemer is invoked. So Wagner even begins to invoke this notion of Christian sanctity and redemption, and this is highly problematic for Nietzsche. And we'll see that. He'll talk about that a little bit later as we go through. And again, remember, the numbers here correspond to the sections of the essay that Nietzsche has. So this is the fourth section. So any of the quotes I have come from these sections. I didn't include the page numbers because you're probably working with a different text than I am, or publication, so or different translations. So you can, if you want to follow along in the text, you can follow along with these section numbers. Now, and again, I'll also say that I'm not covering everything in this. It's just too much, but I'm covering the key points, and you'll see there's a lot of them, right? So, okay, let's go with here for Nietzsche. So one has to separate the work from the artist in order to take both seriously. So Nietzsche doesn't think that we have to just look at Wagner's work and Wagner as being the same thing, is that ultimately to really take both the artist and the work seriously, we have to recognize that they're two distinct things. And we can do that, we can pull them apart. In a certain way, this is a way not to oversimplify Wagner or the analysis of Wagner's work. Nietzsche argues one should guard against a confusion through psychological contiguity, a confusion to which an artist himself is only too prone, right? Now, contiguity just is the sort of British term or I guess English term, for talking about when something's next to or near something else. So simply because the author clearly is near the work that the author creates doesn't mean that the two are the same thing or that we should confuse the two, right? Nietzsche says that the fact is that if he were it, he would not represent, conceive, and express it. A Homer would not have created an Achilles, nor a Goethe a Faust, if Homer had been an Achilles or Goethe a Faust, right? So it's clear here that Homer writes about Achilles, but obviously Homer's not Achilles, because if he was Achilles, he wouldn't be writing about it. He would be living it. That's an important thing to mention here, is that there is a sort of removal between the author of a text and the work and the characters, right? So the author in a certain way is living in a suspended animation compared to their characters. I don't know. At least that's what I kind of think. Let's move on. So what is the meaning of the ascetic ideal? And we're going to see Nietzsche return again and again to this question. The first thing here is let's eliminate the artist. And you'll see here that Nietzsche sort of moves on and stops focusing on Wagner and artist and moves on to look at the ascetic ideal that seems to be contained within the philosopher. And he considers most prominently, number one, Schopenhauer, and number two, Kant. Now, I put Schopenhauer first because I think that Nietzsche's philosophy is more indebted to Schopenhauer than it is Kant. But Kant is the earlier philosopher. So in much of Schopenhauer's work is very much in juxtaposition to Kant. So, but Nietzsche, who's a reader of both, discusses them both, right? So for Kant, the problem is always viewed from the perspective of an impartial spectator, right? So for Kant, if you know Kant's work, and you can take a look at some of the videos I have on Kant if you're not too familiar with it, for Kant, ultimately, the ideal of knowledge is given in an impartial sense. And this means that when we want to look to the aesthetics of something, so if we want to consider art and think about what makes a text beautiful, what makes a landscape beautiful, what makes a life beautiful, right? For Kant, the beautiful can only be appreciated ultimately in an objective manner, which means you have to be an impartial spectator to the beautiful. Kant writes that in the Critique of Judgment, sections 1 through 5, or it's in there, right? That is beautiful, which gives us pleasure without interest. So in other words, Kant seems to be articulating that the things which are beautiful are things which give us pleasure that are independent of our interest and therefore independent of our will. Now, to juxtapose this position, Nietzsche offers a quotation here from Stendhal, which is, the beautiful is a promise of happiness. This is really the direct opposite, because if the beautiful is a promise of happiness, then that means that Stendhal here is emphasizing the way in which we have an interest in the beauty, right? Because all of us want happiness. So if the beautiful is a promise of happiness, then it is a promise regarding our own interest. So you can see here, these are two very diametrically different ways of um, looking at what the beautiful is, and thinking about. And here Nietzsche wants to emphasize the way in which Kant insists upon this impersonal sort of thing, right? In other words, when we look here at Schopenhauer, we can say that Kant's insistence on the disinterested spectator is taken up by Schopenhauer in a sort of personal way. So in much of Schopenhauer's work, which is quite individual to him, I would say, there is a strong indebtedness to his reading of Kant. And so even though Schopenhauer is different than Kant, he really follows through with Kant, but he does so by sort of personalizing the discussion, right? So for instance, Schopenhauer articulates the idea that beauty counteracts our sexual interestedness. The beautiful is what calms the will, right? This is very much in line with Kant, even though it's not the same. For Stendhal, beauty arouses the will. So you have two very different ways of seeing this. And what we see here is that for philosophy, the ascetic ideal, right, the ideal of self-denial, seems to be intertwined with what Nietzsche will refer to as a castration of the will, particularly regarding sensuality. So what does it mean when a philosopher pays homage to the aesthetic ideal, right? Think here about, for instance, Epicurus, who argues that you should seek pleasure, but you should only seek the right pleasures, and you should deny yourself the wrong pleasures. So many philosophers sort of offer these sorts of homage to the ascetic ideal. So what does this mean? Well, Nietzsche thinks that, well, the answer is that the philosopher wants to gain a release from a sort of torture. Now here we start talking about the sort of psychological torture, pain or suffering that is indicative of a stifling of the will. Um, so, but this torture that the philosopher has to overcome is also a sufficient condition for the philosopher. Nietzsche writes that if deprived of his enemies, Schopenhauer here, Schopenhauer's enemies are Hegel, right? He says, so if Schopenhauer were deprived of his enemies, of Hegel, of woman, of sensuality, and the whole will to existence, to persistence, well, without these, Schopenhauer would not himself have persisted. And Nietzsche is arguing here that even though Schopenhauer wants to deprive himself, even though Schopenhauer is seeking a sort of ascetic denial of his own will, right? He wants to deny these other things. Ultimately, without Hegel, without women, without sensuality, without this will to existence, we wouldn't have Schopenhauer, right? So there's this sort of kind of paradox where the overcoming of something is precisely a sufficient condition for the identity of something. And so then Nietzsche refers here, or then articulates the idea that the philosopher tends to disparage sensuality. He writes, every animal instinctively strives for an optimum of favorable conditions under which it can expend all of its energy, strength, and achieve its maximal feeling of power. Every animal harbors, I should say, I think it's arbors, just as instinctively and with the subtlety of discernment that is a higher than reason, every kind of intrusion or hindrance that obstructs or could obstruct this path to the optimum. So this is why philosophers are generally not married, Nietzsche argues, right? Because for the philosopher, to become married is to engage into a commitment to another person, which can be an impediment to ultimately the development of the optimal form of life. And as we mentioned earlier, the optimal form of life for the philosopher is this sort of high spirituality. At least that's how Nietzsche refers to it. Nietzsche discusses the fact that many of the great philosophers were not married at all. And so he's sort of negative on marriage, but that's partially because marriage is an embodied activity, an embodied commitment that is ultimately, that includes a high degree of sensuality, right? And carnality. So The philosopher, by contrast, seeks a desert, right? And so Nietzsche offers this image of the desert. The philosopher is seeking a desert in which they can devoid themselves of all of these distractions, ultimately in order to develop their will towards this sort of ideal, the optimum as he calls it. Now there's three sort of slogans or aspects to the ascetic ideal that can be articulated, if not more. One is an ascetic ideal of poverty. The second is humility, and the third is chastity, right? So poverty means not being grounded down by a desire to attain material things and to gain wealth and power. Humility, a self-denial of the will. Chastity, a self-denial of sensuality. Um, so for the philosopher, though, the most philosophers or professors, at least in the contemporary world, and they sort of live with lots of educated people. But Nietzsche offers the idea that for the philosopher, other people who are educated are themselves a type of desert, right? They are themselves a desert. So for Nietzsche, though, he talks about the mountains are a desert for him. They're a place for him to go and escape these um, distractions ultimately, right? And so here he doesn't ask this in the text, but I'm asking to ask you, where is your desert? Where do you go in order to isolate yourself from distractions in order to attain a sort of higher spirituality or something like this, or enlightenment or whatever phrase you want to use? What is the desert, or is there an ascetic? Is there a place or a way in which you pursue your own type of asceticism, right? Nietzsche continues, for we philosophers need to be spared one thing above all, everything to do with today. We reverence what is still, cold, noble, distant, past, and in which everything in the face of which the soul does not have to defend itself and wrap itself up, what one can speak to without speaking aloud. Here I'm quite reminded that um, of Plato's Phaedo, in which Socrates on his deathbed talks about death as being a healing. And he talks about the idea that death is the ultimate goal for the philosopher, a putting away of that which is active, that which is hot, that which is passionate, right? It's ultimately towards something which is anti-life, right? And he mentions, for instance, there's this motto that it seems that you might say the philosopher lives by, which is he who possesses is possessed. And so you can see here that if you try to possess material things, then the idea would be that the material things possess you, or they possess your will. They capture your will and your consciousness, really. But it doesn't have to be just material things. Here we can talk about sensuality or other people, marriage, and lots of different things. And if the goal of the philosopher is to free themselves of being possessed, then that means they will pursue a self-denial of possessing things, right? So this means that their philosophy does indeed potentially have a close link to asceticism and what Nietzsche has articulated as the ascetic ideal. He writes, philosophy began as all good things begin. For a long time, it lacked the courage for itself. For a long time, it lacked the courage for itself. Whoops, that must be a typo. It was always looking round to see if someone would come and help it. Yet it was afraid of all who looked at it. Draw up a list of the various propensities and the virtues of the philosopher. His bent to doubt, his bent to deny, his bent to suspend judgment, his bent to analyze, his bent to investigate, seek, dare, etc. It is not clear that for the longest time, all of them contravened the basic demands of morality and conscience. But now we can say is that Nietzsche says we violate ourselves today. There's no doubt of it. We nutcrackers of the soul, every questioning and questionable, as if life were nothing but cracking nuts, and thus we're bound to grow day by day more questionable, worthier of asking questions, perhaps also worthier of living. You can see here Nietzsche ends this quotation with a question mark, which is if the philosopher constantly is violating their own desires and their own will and their own life by seeking questions and denying themselves, what kind of life is this? Now, Nietzsche obviously is indebted to the philosophers and he's not attacking philosophy, per se, but he's offering a critique regarding the psychological motivations that seem to underlie what we might call as the sort of modernist philosopher, the modern philosopher. Though he would say it goes all the way back to Plato. So I don't know how modern that really is. The other thing in this section that the philosopher indicates is that all the virtues that we hold today were once vices, right? He says, when suffering was everywhere counted as a virtue, cruelty is a virtue, disassembling is a virtue, revenge is a virtue, slander of reason is a virtue, and when, on the other hand, well-being was counted as a danger, thirst for knowledge is a danger, peace was a danger, pity is a danger, being pitied as a disgrace, work as a disgrace, madness as divine, change is the very essence of immortality and pregnant with disaster. So here, this is sort of just another rumination, a reminder of what we saw in the very first treatise here, the Genealogy, namely that our virtues tend to turn into vices and our vices tend to turn into virtues when we take into account this difference in this movement between master and slave morality. And remember, it's all about the will. Number 10, contemplation. When we think about contemplation, we think about, obviously, philosophy is a type of activity of contemplation. And Nietzsche goes back and says, when contemplation first appears on the earth, it is a sort of disguise, right? The earliest philosophers endowed their existence with the meaning in which others would fear them, right? Here I'm thinking of the pre-Socratic philosopher. I think it's Anaximander. Someone can tell me if I forgot it and I'm telling the wrong pre-Socratic philosopher. They'll put it in the comments if I'm wrong. I didn't look it up ahead of time. But I believe it's Anaximander threw himself into a volcano so that everyone would believe that since there was no body, he was a god, or he was divine, or he was ascended in heaven, or something like this, right? So you see, these earliest philosophers seem to live on a type of existence and articulate and build out a type of meaning for their lives that has a social function of other people fearing them. It's sort of interesting. He says the philosophical spirit always had to use as a mask and a cocoon the previously established types of the contemplative man, the priest, the sorcerer, the soothsayer, and in any case a religious type, in order to be able to exist at all. So that ascetic ideal for a long time served the philosopher as a form in which to appear as a precondition of existence. He had to represent it so as to be able to be a philosopher. He had to believe it in order to be able to represent it. So you have this sort of interesting thing between the distinction between that which appears and that which is real. And it sort of indicates here that the earliest philosophers took on an ascetic form of existence in order to appear a certain way, but in appearing it, they essentially became it, or at least they began to believe it. So Nietzsche is offering sort of interesting, I think, prehistorical analysis of the origins of philosophy itself. He says, for the longest time, philosophy would not have been possible at all on earth without ascetic wraps and cloak, without an ascetic self misunderstanding, right? So asceticism has at its core, philosophy has its core, a deep relationship to asceticism on Nietzsche's view. Let's move forward. The ascetic priest, an ascetic priest here, of course, you can think of as the Christian priest, but it doesn't have to be a Christian priest. Anyone who is, I guess, practicing religiously asceticism and enforcing it on others would be an ascetic priest. But the ascetic priest links his or her will to power with the interest of the ascetic ideal. So asceticism is not the denial of will, it's rather an activity of the will. The ascetic treats life as a wrong road on which one must finally walk back to where it begins, but it's still a road in which one walks, right? So the activity of the will does not perish, despite its denial of itself. Now, Earth can be almost conceived of as an ascetic prison planet, and Nietzsche offers this really sort of interesting analogy here. He says, read from a distant star, the majuscule script of our earthly existence would perhaps lead to the conclusion that the Earth was the distinctively ascetic planet, a nook of disgruntled, arrogant, and offensive creatures, filled with a profound disgust at themselves, at the earth, at all life, who inflict as much pain on themselves as they possibly can out of, well, pleasure in inflicting pain, which is probably, well, their only pleasure. So Nietzsche imagines here, if aliens could sort of see what human beings are like on Earth, and they saw this ascetic ideal as totally intertwined, not only to the philosophical spirit, but into our moral spirit, they would think this is a quite bizarre world, right? Where the type of pleasure these people have is pain and it's suffering. Um, and at the heart of this ascetic ideal, ultimately, is ressentiment. It's resentment. And you can see here that Nietzsche is bringing back again the linchpin category he articulated in the first essay about how master morality, how the slaves of the masters in the Roman Empire essentially gave birth to a creative hatred in which they inverted the moral order. This is ressentiment. Where does it come from? Or how is it related? It's related to this ascetic ideal. So, and we'll see here that you don't have to be a Christian in order to have this ascetic ideal, which means that ressentiment is not simply a category that's indicative of the transition of, between Roman and Christian morality. It's indicative of something regarding human nature. Now, Nietzsche rejects the philosophical Kantian attitude that endorses the idea of the impersonal spectator, right? And this includes specific philosophical concepts and categories, things like the pure subject, the will-less, painless, timeless knowing subject, concepts such as pure reason. Think here about Kant's primary work, the Critique of Pure Reason. Also, there's a rejection here of the notion of absolute spirit. Think of Hegel. The notion, a rejection of knowledge in itself. Think of most philosophers. Aristotle would be a good example there. And Nietzsche wants to reject these philosophical attitudes as ultimately built upon a misunderstanding of human life. Right? By contrast, Nietzsche develops and articulates and endorses what today we would call as perspectivism. And this is the idea, and I mentioned this in another video, but it's ultimately the idea that our knowledge of the world is grounded in the subjective perspective we have of the world, which means that our knowledge is a function of the will. It's not something that's outside of it in this impersonal, spectatorial way that Kant would have it. Nietzsche writes, "There is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing, and the more affects we allow to speak about one thing, the more eyes, different eyes, we can use to observe one thing. The more complete our concept of this thing, our objectivity will be." So it looks like here is that we have multiple perspectives, and the more perspectives we take in, the more objective our ideas will be. But you can see here is that epistemologically, this means that objectivity is functionally built upon a plurality of subjectivities. Take a look at the work of Edmund Husserl, who has a very interesting discussion regarding the nature of objectivity and its basis on subjectivity. So if you want to take a look at a contemporary philosopher, a phenomenologist who talks about something similar, take a look at Edmund Husserl's work. Moving to section 13, we see that the ascetic ideal springs from the protective instinct of a degenerating life, which tries by all means to sustain itself and to fight for its existence. So the ascetic ideal is a type of a reaction, if you will. It's a way of fighting back against the degeneration of our life and the degeneration of the will over time. So the ascetic priest, even though the ascetic priest is a denier of life, the ascetic priest is actually cultivating life, or is acting out of a desire for life, right? The ascetic priest is both a naysayer and a yes-saying force, if you will, right? That should be no saying, not yo-aying, right? So, but that means the ascetic priest has this complicated, contradictory role, though it may be unknown to them in particular. Now, the ascetic ideal for Nietzsche is a type of sickness. It is not something that's bad or evil. It is rather understood as a deficiency of will, right? Or it's sort of disease, Nietzsche argues. And you'll recall here is that even previously Nietzsche referred to the development of the bad consciousness is also a type of sickness. So notice here that for Nietzsche, the categorical distinction is between health and sickness. It's not between good versus evil or good versus bad. These are amoral categories. And remember, Nietzsche is developing a psychological analysis of morality ultimately, and that would make sense that these are amoral categories that stand at the basis of morality. He writes, examine the background of every family, every organization, every commonwealth, everywhere the struggle of the sick against the healthy. So the ascetic ideal that Nietzsche is recognizing here is universal in human life, in human culture, and it seems to transcend time. Because we see this ascetic ideal in pretty much every time period as well. It's not just simply a function of our contemporary world or even the Christian world. It seems to be everywhere. But what Nietzsche recognizes is the sickness seems to be everywhere. Now, what's motivating this sickness? Well, it has to do with resentment. And resentment of what? Resentment of pleasure and pain, right? Here's what it is the priest alters the direction of ressentiment, the direction of resentment, and directs it inward upon the individual in a form of self-denial, which means that ressentiment becomes a form of anesthesia. It becomes a way of making one forget the feeling of pain. What's the feeling of pain? It's the denial of one's own will to power. So the ascetic ideal exploits the bad instinct of all the sufferers for the purpose of self-discipline, self-surveillance, and self-overcoming. Particularly, I want to emphasize here the notion of self-discipline and self-surveillance. Well, actually, and self-overcoming. And in the next video lecture part of this series, we're going to be looking at some chapters from Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, where he specifically looks at the way in which the modern world enforces a type of self-discipline, a type of self-surveillance, and ultimately a type of self-overcoming. We're going to see next time that Foucault sees himself really as a Nietzschean, right? And in many ways, I think he's the contemporary version of Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche indicates that the entire situation is physiological at the end of the day, and that the psychological suffering we're talking about is actually tantamount to a physiological problem. He says this, or at least that's how I read what he's writing here. He says, a strong and well-constituted man digests his experiences as he digests his meals, even when he has to swallow some tough morsels. If he can't get over an experience and have done with it, this kind of indigestion is as much physiological as is the other, and often a consequence of the other. So with such a conception, one can, between ourselves, still be the sternest opponent of all materialism. So it's sort of interesting here. Nietzsche is offering the idea here that there is a sort of material basis for this condition, even the psychological condition we've been discussing, but that simply because there's a material basis doesn't mean we have to argue for materialism. In fact, Nietzsche himself is a stern opponent to materialism, and we'll see why that is. It really has to do with the idea that materialism, at least contemporary materialism, becomes its own form of anesthetizing the soul or anesthetizing the will. So Nietzsche is going to extend his critique of asceticism in section 17 to Christianity in particular, in which he will specifically argue that this notion of redemption, redemption from sin, redemption from your will, is itself a type of hypnotism. It's a way of lulling yourself out of suffering and pain, ultimately, which is driven by your psychological instincts not to be in pain, right? The will in order to also develop and embolden the will to power. Now, in this section, Nietzsche actually talks quite a bit about things. I'm going to skip through it because there's a lot of discussion, so I'll leave it to you to take a look at. But what we do see in the next section is that there's another form of this hypnotic muting of sensitivity, of this capacity to feel pain, and that is mechanical activity. And here, think about our daily lives. Think about the way in which when we fall into a pattern of regularity, which is a type of sort of unthinking obedience to the type of life we're living, this becomes a sort of training for the impersonal, a type of self-forgetting. So you don't have to be the philosopher to have this ascetic ideal, right? You don't even have to be a Christian. You can just simply be someone whose existence gets poured into a type of mechanical activity in which is governed through a sort of regularity. Now, on the other hand, think now about the way in which, if you live in a capitalist society, as most people do, think of the way in which a capitalist society regulates the movement of your life, the movement of your existence, right? You have a job, you're forced to go to work at 8 a.m., come home at 5. Most people have these 9 to 5 jobs, and when they go to their work, they principally just do the same things over and over and over again. Notice this. This is a type of mechanical activity which is developed into an ascetic ideal. Think about it. If your job, my wife, for instance, she works at a company where typical 9 to 5 job, and sometimes she likes her job, but oftentimes she at least expresses to me that her job can feel quite meaningless. Meaningless personally, right? It's quite impersonal though. It's a self, but it becomes a way in which you're supposed to, as an employee, give up literally 40 hours a week of your life, if not more, to your job, right? And this is a type of way in which you can anesthetize yourself. So some people do this. Think about workaholics, for instance. Maybe you're a workaholic. I am kind of, but think about that for a moment. So the ascetic ideal that Nietzsche is discussing in the Origin of Genealogy of Morality extends to many other types of activities that go simply beyond the ones that he's really been attacking so far in the text. Now, when we go back to Christianity, we can say that in Christianity, this same sorts of hypnotization and anesthetization emerges as the pleasure found in giving pleasure. For instance, think about the emphasis that Christian thought places on doing good, giving, relieving, helping, encouraging people, consoling people, and there's a whole range of values that Christianity argues are necessary. And Nietzsche seems to suggest that these are based in pleasure, really. And it's a sort of petty pleasure, the idea that you get pleasure by giving pleasure to others. So by prescribing a love of neighbor, the ascetic priest prescribes fundamentally an excitement of the strongest, most life-affirming drive, namely the will to power. So even in the case where you're supposed to do unto others as you have them do unto you, love your neighbor as you will yourself, right? Notice that when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, the core concept is still the self, and it's still the will of the self. So even in this denial of oneself through the ascetic priest, we still have a life-affirming drive towards the will to power. Another form of the way in which we can hypnotize and anesthetize our will is through the herd. And we talked in one of the earlier videos about Nietzsche's notion of the herd instinct. He thinks we naturally, instinctually herd, and we naturally conform to each other. This you can think of as group conformity. And you can ask yourself, do this simple experiment. Next time you're in a elevator, try to stand and face the other direction as everyone else. And you'll find it's very difficult. And if you do, one of two things will happen. Either you will feel very awkward and so will everyone else in the elevator, or everyone will follow you. They will do exactly what you do. In fact, there's a famous psychological experiment where they did this, where there was a gentleman who would go into an elevator and he would turn and then everyone else would turn too. And he would just turn in circles and everyone would follow him naturally. So we have this natural tendency to do what others do and to congregate in herds, right, in Nietzsche's words. So the formation of a herd, according to Nietzsche, is a significant victory, and it's an advance in the struggle against oppression. With the growth of a community, a new interest grows for the individual too, and often lifts him or her above the most personal element in their discontent, which is their aversion to themselves. Again, I apologize for the slight typos. I've been typing this all day, and I missed all this, so I'm sorry about that. Hopefully it's helpful, though. And this thing about it, when you join a community and you take up the burdens or the desires or the will of a community, in a certain way you find meaning in a place that allows you to get away from yourself, right? And this seems to be, I personally find this to be the case. When I'm left to my own devices, sometimes I fall into a deep despair in which I will sometimes frequently just think to myself, man, you are such a failure. And I will go and just really focus on all of my problems and all of this sort of thing. But in order to get out of that, I'll call someone up, go to the bar or go somewhere and hang out with people. And by joining others, I can escape myself. So this is one of the other primary mechanisms. And Nietzsche indicates here is that the people who have a strong will tend to separate themselves from others, and the people who have a weak will, or people who are weak, tend to congregate. So the strong separate while the weak congregate. Now, these forms of hypnotism are considered in the modern world to be really innocent means in the struggle against our displeasures and against our depressions. And he gives examples here of some famous authors in which this seems to be the case. He talks about when Lord Byron dies, Thomas More burned all of Lord Byron's work. And Dr. Gwinner did the same with Schopenhauer's work. And what we see here is that there is this interesting thing in which when when people die, or when we want to die, when people die, they will frequently ask that their personal effects are destroyed because they don't want their self revealed, it would seem. And Nietzsche offers an interesting thought experiment. He says, imagine if there was a biography of Martin Luther which focused on him as cultivating the activity of the will to power, which would be very, very different from the type of Martin Luther we know from the history of Protestantism. Now, there is reason enough, Nietzsche asked, is there not, for us psychologists nowadays to be unable to shake off a certain mistrust of ourselves? And given all of this, right, when we look to our psychological constitution and we do this origin of morality, what we see is that, yeah, there's good reason not to trust the reasons we say we do things for. Because it appears there, and remind yourself of the notion of sublimation. Sublimation is when you can't achieve something, you find something else to take its place. And it looks like the ascetic ideal is a type of activity of sublimation. Nietzsche suggests that the ascetic ideal enables what he calls an orgy of feelings, despite its character of self-denial. That is, the person who lives in the ascetic ideal, let's say the philosopher who's living in their desert of educated people. Think of the philosopher in their tower at their university office, right, where they're surrounded by their books and they don't have to actually live and engage in the world, right? This ascetic ideal enables a type of orgy of feelings. It enables feelings of pleasure, even though its formation and its process appears to be one of self-denial. Nietzsche says that everywhere somehow I cut that off. Everywhere the sinner breaking himself on the cruel wheel of a restless, morbidly lascivious conscience, everywhere dumb torment, extreme fear, the agony of a tortured heart, convulsions of an unknown happiness, and a cry for redemption, right? So, and by the way, people have been complaining that I say right too much in the videos, and I know it is kind of annoying, so my apologies. I'm trying my best to get myself off of that. But anyway, the asceticism, even though it's a self-denial, is actually still organized around a principle of sensation and sensuality. Now, Nietzsche characterizes the modern moral improvement of humanity, what we would call the improvement of humanity. If it's an improvement, it's weakness, it's discouraging, it makes us refined, it makes us more effeminate, and emasculates us, right? Nietzsche characterizes this process, the process of the ascetic ideal that takes place in all of these different ways, as a form of treatment for the sick, which increases the sickness, though. Because as this self-denial, it's sort of as if the self-denial of the ascetic is really just digging their grave deeper and deeper and deeper. And Nietzsche suggests that this is the case across the entire spectrum of moral life, because slave morality has won the day, as it were. So the ascetic priest has ruined the psychical health wherever he's come to power, Nietzsche says. And Nietzsche here gives an interesting sort of discussion where he says he really doesn't like the New Testament, because the New Testament, of course, with Jesus Christ arguing that you ought to do others as you do unto yourself, you deny your own self, the poor will, the poor will inherit the earth, and so on and so forth. Nietzsche thinks the New Testament really embodies this ascetic ideal, and he doesn't like it whatsoever. But he says, but all hail to the Old Testament. He loves the Old Testament because in the Old Testament you have great human beings who are acting out their will, right? And they're not simply denying themselves. And so this is quite interesting. Think here about King David in the Bible, where King David, obviously from the Christian perspective, King David denies himself towards God. But I think Nietzsche here is suggesting that if you ignore the New Testament, when you look at the Old Testament, when you ignore the New Testament and look at the Old one, what you see is that human beings are acting out of their own will. And they're acting more in line with this master morality we talked about in the very first section. So the focus here, though, has to be on the meaning of ascetic existence, not simply the products or the activities of ascetic existence. So what exactly is the meaning of ascetic existence? And what's the meaning of this the power that the ascetic priest holds, or that the ascetic ideal holds over individuals? Keep in mind here that Nietzsche will characterize the ascetic meaning as something which totalizes and reinterprets our worldly totalities. Now, that is not a phrase that Nietzsche uses. That's my characterization of how Nietzsche discusses it in section 23. He does suggest that the ascetic ideal eventually takes over, and we begin to understand all things according to and in line with it. So the meaning of ascetic existence, part of it has to do with its totality. Now, the meaning of ascetic existence isn't simply about religion. And I think a lot of readers of Nietzsche like to think that, that they're above all of his criticisms regarding Christianity and slave morality and all of this stuff, because they are good scientists and they believe in science and they're atheists. Well, guess what? In this section, Nietzsche's going to directly attack science, scientism, and atheist, because he thinks that the type of science we have today, which is a good thing, he's not against it, and he doesn't think we should stop doing science, but he thinks that science has become its own form of the aesthetic ideal. And so even if you're not a Christian and you're watching this video, Nietzsche thinks and you see yourself as something of a scientific mind, having a scientific mindset, Nietzsche thinks, guess what? Your own identity is also wrapped up in this aesthetic ideal. Take a look what he says. He says, science today has absolutely no belief in itself, let alone an ideal above it. And where it still inspires passion, love, ardor, and suffering at all, it is not the opposite of the aesthetic ideal, but rather the latest and the noblest form of it. So it's a noble form of it. So Nietzsche gives some credence here. And he says over and over as caveats that he's not trying to attack science or scientists. But I think what Nietzsche is articulating here is that science, because the science itself doesn't believe anything beyond itself, right? It becomes a type of self-denial. Because in Nietzsche's view, the master of morality believes in themselves. They believe in their own will to power. Science today is a hiding place for every kind of discontent, disbelief, gnawing work, bad conscience. It is the unrest of the lack of ideals, the suffering from the lack of any great love, the discontent in the face of involuntary contentment. Right? So science here becomes a means it becomes maybe the pinnacle of ascetic idealism, in the sense that a person who's constantly thinking of science, or who we might call as fallen prey to scientism, is a person who has actually endorsed a type of self-narcissism. But what does that mean exactly? It means that by using science, they have found a way to flee from their own will, to flee from their own suffering and pain. And you ask yourself this: do you have an experience of this? Or actually, Nietzsche asks us, the reader, do you have an experience of that? Is this what science is for you? Is it a form of escapism, not simply a form of pursuing knowledge? Now, the great fear of modern life, Nietzsche mentions, is the regaining of consciousness. And that is the consciousness of our own will to power and our own wills. And he thinks we're scared to do this, and we've been trained not to do it. And scientism is the new form in which we are able to flee from ourselves and able to forget our own consciousness of ourselves. And with this in mind, we can read Nietzsche when he says, we men of knowledge, and remember at the very preface of the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche talks about that men of knowledge are actually unknown to themselves. So he says, we men of knowledge have gradually come to distrust believers of all kinds. Our mistrust has gradually brought us to make inferences the reverse of those former days. So what we see here is that this distrust in ourselves has led us to invert these virtues. And we saw earlier how Nietzsche was trying to trace the way in which our virtues can be inverted. And so what was once a vice becomes a virtue, and what was once a virtue now has become a vice. So nothing, and here we get this famous phrase, I put it up there at the top, which is, nothing is true, everything is permitted. And this was the phrase of, I believe it was a medieval secret sect called the Sect of Assassins. The Christians fought during the Crusades, and they had this view, this sect of assassins, that nothing was true and everything was permitted. That ultimately they were nihilists, right? And this seems to be an important recognition of what Nietzsche's talking about, right? That was the freedom of spirit. In that way, the faith in truth itself was abrogated. So there's no science without presuppositions. That's another point that's important, because at the heart of scientism is a type of metaphysical faith. And this point is often made by Christians who want to criticize science. And Nietzsche agrees, which is namely that the scientist has a metaphysical faith in the process of science itself. He says, quote, "It is still a metaphysical faith that underlies our faith in science. And we men of knowledge today, we godless men and anti-metaphysicians, we too still derive our flame from the fire ignited by a faith a millennia old, the Christian faith, which was also Plato's, that God is truth and that truth is divine." Notice here that Nietzsche's view is that truth is sculpted. It's something developed out of the will. And this faith that the truth is somehow metaphysically beyond us, and it's something that we can discover and attain to. This same kind of faith, though it's not articulated by scientists in this way, is held by scientists, because science holds nothing sacred. Science wants to understand the world. I'm thinking the physical sciences, at least, wants to understand the world in terms of how the world is. But that means that we have a faith that it's possible to do that. And that's not something that science can itself prove, because it seems to be a presupposition for science, or at least the faith that people have and place in science. Now again, Nietzsche is not arguing that science is bad or that science is a type of religion. Ultimately, though, that science is a part of the evolution of this moral train. It's not something outside of it. So that means that for those of you who are reading Nietzsche and are atheist and think, oh yeah, I don't want to fall into that, you have to realize here that he's arguing that science is not going to be the way out, per se. In that it's just a new form of the way in. So the effects, and think here that science rests upon the same foundation as the ascetic ideal, a certain type of improvement of life, right? Improvement of life. The effects grown cool, the tempo of life slowed down, dialectics in place of instinct, seriousness imprinted on faces and gestures. Right? This is a description of what scientism is, or what the scientific ideal is. The cool-headed person who thinks, who debates, who reasons, and who's always serious, right? In fact, Nietzsche thinks that the best ascetic ideal today is modern science. Modern science is the perfect encapsulation of this ascetic ideal. He writes, "Since Copernicus, man seems to have got himself on an inclined plane. Now he's slipping faster and faster away from the center. Into what? Into nothingness. Into a penetrating sense of his nothingness? Very well. Hasn't this been the straightest route to the old ideal?" Sorry, I made that too small. I can't make it. Oh, there we go. Hasn't this been the straightest route to the old ideal? So you can see here is that scientism for Nietzsche plays a role in our moral development insofar as it's a way back to the very beginning. It's a type of willing towards nothingness. Notice that in contemporary science, in the contemporary world, we reject teleology. That is, we don't think that the world has a natural purpose or direction or aim. And so the scientist doesn't look at the sun and think, what's the purpose of the sun, right? The scientist looks at the sun and says, here's what the sun does, here's what its effects are. But whether or not it has a meaning or a purpose, it's devoid of all of those. Science completely rejects that. In other words, we reject that the world has meaning. And he says here, we no longer really seek to prove anything. It looks like we've given up the will to prove truth in favor of just a will to describe the world as we can. And here I can't help but think about in the modern academy. So I'm a professor and I teach lots of classes, and I go to conferences and I talk to lots of different people at the university, at the desert, my own desert, as Nietzsche might say. But one of the things I noticed is that increasingly there is a sort of pervasive nihilism, not just among the students, but among my colleagues, in which they tend to reject the notion that there really is any meaning to anything, and they no longer seek to prove anything. Sometimes this has been called sort of postmodern malaise. I think what Nietzsche would say it is this is just the high point, the high water mark of the aesthetic ideal. This is a part of the evolution of this moral development which began 2,000 plus years ago. Now Nietzsche turns his attack on the atheist, because the atheist ultimately is also having a type of aesthetic ideal, but their aesthetic ideal is given by the fact that now they're denying their own will to believe in God, which Nietzsche thinks is a will to truth. He thinks that's good because he doesn't think that God exists. But he thinks that the person who says, I'm an atheist, and is a proud, staunch atheist, has not actually extricated themselves from the moral slave morality we saw in the first treatise. He writes, everywhere else that the spirits are strong, mighty, and at worth, without counterfeit today, it does without ideals of any kind. The popular expression for this abstinence is atheism, except for its will to truth. So unconditional, honest atheism is not the antithesis of that ideal, the aesthetic ideal, as it appears to be. It's rather only one of the latest phases of its evolution, one of its terminal forms and its inner consequences. It is the awe-inspiring catastrophe of 2,000 years of training in truthfulness that finally forbids itself the like involved in the like involved in the belief in God. So the atheist too is also a part of this evolution of asceticism. Now, all great things, Nietzsche says, bring about their own destruction through an act of self-overcoming. And that's what it seems to be with the case of slave morality in particular, as it is slowly, right, slave morality begins with Christianity, but it looks like now it has overcome itself in its sort of self-overcoming in terms of atheism, but it's still in the same movement. Nietzsche writes, Christianity as a dogma was destroyed by its own morality. In the same way, Christianity as morality must now perish too. We stand on the threshold of this event. So Nietzsche, as normal, is constantly looking ahead to a potential future, a paradigm shift with Übermensch, back to a sort of master morality, or to something new, probably something new. So what does this mean at the end? Well, it means that we as human beings have derived our meaning from an aesthetic ideal. We contemporary modern human beings, you watching this video, and also think he doesn't mention, but I think technology for us today has become a way for us to also anesthetize our own suffering. Think about Facebook, for instance. When people are on Facebook and they're posting mainly pictures of things they do, but they only post the pictures of things that make them look good, you can see here they are fleeing from themselves. Right? But the aesthetic ideal reveals ultimately that our own meaning is itself lacking. So we see here that Nietzsche recognizes that all of these developments in the modern world, where people think that they've overcome all of this ancient religion and all of this business, they haven't. And we're still struggling with this primary question of what does it mean to live in the world? What does our own sense of living mean? And it looks like primarily we're still following through with the logic of the aesthetic ideal. Now, let me give you this final passage. This is the last passage in the book. He says, we can no longer conceal from ourselves what is expressed by all that willing, which has taken its direction from the aesthetic ideal, this hatred of the human, and even more of the animal, and more still of the material, this horror of the senses, of reason itself, this reason of happiness and beauty, this longing to get away from all appearance, change, becoming, death, wishing from longing itself. All this means, let us dare to grasp it, a will to nothingness, an aversion to life, a rebellion against the most fundamental presuppositions of life, but it is and remains a will. And to repeat in the conclusion what I said at the beginning, man would rather will nothingness than not will, right? So at the end of the day, Nietzsche's putting down his money on the idea that the will to power is the central principle for the activity of morality. It's at the very core of the origin of morality. So this will conclude our discussion of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality. In the next video, we're going to begin looking at some of the excerpts from Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, which I take to be really the next step in Nietzsche's discussion of morality. And in particular, looking at how socially and institutionally we are essentially disciplining and punishing people based upon this ascetic ideal. So that's what we're going to take a look at in the next video. Again, I appreciate you all for watching. I appreciate all of you who are kind with me. I know I make mistakes and mispronunciations. People have been commenting on that. I'm trying my best. So thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you guys online next time. Okay, bye.